Welcome to a new series that I'm provisionally calling Coaching with Close Order, where I will break down concepts, go through sort of strategic approaches. In this one, I'm going to talk about how to approach the scoring in the new missions, because it's quite diverse. I want to specifically look at mostly strategic locations, go from there, but a lot of it's going to be applicable to multiple different ways of scoring, whether that's King of the Hill or, strategic locations, any end of game scoring as well you can think about in these sorts of terms. This video is brought to you by the Close Order Coaching Patron. If you're interested in more information than you can get on a Fix My List, or you're looking to work on specific aspects of your game that maybe I haven't covered in a video, this is the place to do so. Coaching comes in two tiers, either a one-on-one, 1 hour chat where we can discuss list building, various aspects of your game, what you'd like to improve on, or a 3-hour coaching game where we can go more in depth onto certain aspects. Both tiers come with a personal Discord channel where you can ask me questions, get list advice, or just plan out what we want to address in the next session. If you have any questions, you can ask on the coaching section of the Close Order Discord, and you can book my time anywhere from 9 AM to 11 PM local time, depending on the day. The first thing that I want to do is talk about some terms, or a specific term that I'm going to use, and that is in terms of objectives. There are 3 different objectives, let's say on this map where we're looking at strategic locations 3. There could be 4, there could be 2. I like this one because it is the best example of the thought process that I'm going to go through. And what is that thought process? Well, first of all, you've got one objective in the middle. That is, it's contested. You could call that as a contested objective, or, the central objective, whatever you want to go for. This one that neither player really has an advantage over. Then, assuming that you're coming from this side, you are the X player and your opponent is the O player, you've got one objective here, which is significantly easier for you to get than your opponent. And I refer to that as the natural objective, just to steal a term from StarCraft. Basically, this objective here, as you can see, is significantly easier for you to get from this side of the board than it is for your opponent to get on this side of the board. What does that mean? Well, you can start holding it from your deployment zone. If you've got a unit that's sat in here, look, it's within the 6 inches, you can be touching that with your core unit, your unit strength 10 unit. You can be scoring that very early. Even if you go second, you can deploy so that you're going to be racking up points from this one from the off. And I think that's very important to be aware of. Maybe you don't do it every game, depending on what you're facing up against, but it's something that you want to be aware of and take advantage of as much as possible. Then on the other side, we've got the opponent's natural objective, and I haven't really got a specific term for this one other than don't put too much effort into it. This is going to be the one that your opponent's going to be scoring more easily. Yes, you want to take them off it if possible, but it's going to be a lot harder for you to contest this objective over here than it is for you to contest the one on the left-hand side, the one that's really easy for you to get. Now, Strategic Locations 3 shows this the best. Let's have a quick look at what it looks like in terms of 2 and 4. Just to very quickly show what the scoring looks like on something like Close Quarters, which I'll be honest, the more I look at it, the less I feel like it is a worthwhile objective setup to play. But if you look at it on Close Quarters, you can see there's no objective in the center. There's nothing over here to contest. There's nothing to fight over. So that pushes you to be more defensive or overly aggressive if you want to contest your opponent, because you've got your natural objective here, and then there's no contested objective in the center. There's just your opponent's natural as well. So we're going to be playing very defensively around this one. Potentially that's where you put your own personal scoring Death Star, your big unit of core unit, zombies or men-at-arms, whatever you're bringing. And then on the other side of the board, maybe you're not even super bothered about scoring this one. You're maybe just looking to push your opponent off it and stop them from scoring it, something along those lines. So in terms of Strategic Locations 2, I don't think this has much breakdown to it other than push directly towards your opponent. Let's have a look at 4. For Strategic Locations 4, there are 2 maps that you theoretically could be playing on, as long as we're looking at just sort of the standard Games Workshop layouts that they've given us, which I think people will play around with. But looking at the baseline standard objective setups they've gone for, you can either go for Upon the Fields of Glory, which is the old, battle lines where you can pick any of the strategic locations, or you've got Encirclement. And I think Encirclement shows well how I'd recommend you think about playing this sort of mission. Now, as you can see, there are 4 objectives here. One of them is going to be super easy to hold. This is your natural objective. Super easy. You can put something on it. It doesn't have to be a high commitment. So, for example, if we're looking at Bretonnians, you might bring 1 unit of men-at-arms and then a couple of unit peasant bowmen. This unit here, or this objective here, super this is a fantastic place to put Peasant Bowmen. It doesn't have to be something that's takes a lot of commitment, maybe just 14 skirmishing archers. That's the sort of unit I like to put on these objectives where you don't have to put a huge level of effort into holding them, but something that they're not going to die immediately to a Ruby Ring of Ruin, something like that. So that's your natural objective. And then in the center, you've got 2 contested objectives. How are you going to play this? Well, it depends on your opponent's army, because if they're bringing some sort of full send list and you've got to play defensive, you probably can't look to contest both of them. If you're playing the full send list, if you're the one who's got the much more aggressive army, if you're playing, for example, a large bus of Chaos Knights and then you've got a couple of dragons, something like that, and you feel like you can put the pressure onto your opponent like so, you can just run forwards with everything and you can try and contest both of the central objectives. Remember, you don't have to hold them to stop your opponent from holding them. All you have to do is physically stop them getting within 6 inches with a unit strength 10 core unit, which is pretty easy to do. Potentially, you might have a unit of Chaos Knights sat on the objective like this. Sure, your opponent could come forwards and stand on the objective, but by doing so, they're giving you an easy charge. And make sure that you're positioning so that your overruns make sense. You're not, potentially coming onto this objective, sitting like here and facing away from everything else, away from the rest of the battle. That's not going to do you any good. It is easier to get there, as you can see. You could start in your deployment zone here, you can walk up, and then you're facing in this sort of direction anyway. That's not going to do you any good. So you're going to want to make sure that you're coming around, positioning in this sort of direction so you can face towards the rest of the battle. And that's just a general concept that I think most people probably have cottoned onto at this point. And again, if you're doing it on the other side here, you're probably coming around like this, or in this case, you've got more deployment zones. So you could start more over here, move directly over to your left a little bit, be within the threatening range of this objective, and then charge forward. So, super easy. If you're playing the aggressor, if you're playing the beatdown, we know what the plan's going to be. Try and hold this with as little as possible, full violence onto these 2 objectives, and if you can crush into the center in sort of the second half of the game, great. You're taking your opponent off all of the points. You're potentially scoring some points maybe here and maybe here, depending on what you've been able to move onto them. Fantastic stuff. But you're more playing to a denial playstyle. What if you and your opponent both have roughly the same level of commitment? Well, that's where this goes from being a Dawn of War, long ways deployment, where you're facing off like this, and it becomes more hammer and anvil. The old Mountain Pass style deployment, where you're deploying on these sides and you're moving towards the center. Now, it's not exactly that, because you're going to be playing around, probably, spoilers, these 2 objectives. Why are we saying that? Well, it's easier for you to put more of your army on this side of the board. It's harder for your opponent to put more on this side of the board. So you can come around like so, and you can look to hold these sorts of areas. Here's a quick example of what it might look like in terms of if you're trying to deploy against someone who's got a very similar level of aggression and you want to try and make sure you're scoring as many points but aiming to remove your opponent's scoring as much as possible as well. These are old lists, so this is not necessarily a representative snapshot of the meta. It's an old Beastman list and an old Troll Horde list that I've put together. But as you can see here, we've got one really big scoring unit in the center. For the Beastman player, they've got a big unit of Gore or Ungor with, maybe a Doomball in there, a BSB. Some really heavy commitment. They're saying that I really want to have this objective here. And the reason for that is, actually, if you think about turning the board like so, this objective centrally, these 2 in the center here, they go from being the natural at the start of the game to becoming the contested objective. It's much easier for you to press into these central objectives against your opponent than potentially this one if you've skewed more heavily to your right, as opposed to, deploying more just lining up against each other. Why would you line up against each other? Because that's something that I don't feel like I've touched on. If you're thinking about what the easiest way to consolidate the scoring is, you can think about the game in terms of triangles, and I will probably do a full video breakdown on this, but you don't want to be going as far apart as possible. So if you want to be able to support your opponents, you don't want to be going, okay, let's say I've got a unit here, I've got a dragon here on objective 1, and I want to threaten objective 2. Okay, great. How far apart are they? Those 2 objectives are 35 inches apart. That's a huge distance. That's a whole turn of marching, 20 inches, and then it's a moderately long charge for the dragon as well. So there's even risk that you fail, and especially if, the dragon's starting off let's say not even on the objective, the dragon's starting off over here, and it wants to threaten over here, suddenly you're looking at 40 plus inches, 46 inches, that's 2 turns of movement. That's just really difficult to support yourself, and you don't want to be putting yourself in a position where, if you're looking to consistently score points, you have to send models on multiple turns of travel to contest. So, what are we thinking? Well, we want to keep our lines as small as possible. From here to here, we're talking 20 inches. If you're stood on this side of the objective and you have to threaten someone here, that's pretty reasonably doable. Look, you know, looking at 17 inches, that's a very doable charge for like a wyvern or a dragon, or maybe even some fast cavalry or heavy cavalry if you're playing elves, stuff like that. It's very in the realm of possibilities for support. Or worst case scenario, you know, if you're here and there, 17 inches, you can march 8 inches forwards, even if you're just an infantry unit, 8 to here, and then you've suddenly got an 8-9 inch charge. And again, theoretically that's a longer charge for the infantry, but you could just march forwards again and you could put a larger unit of scoring troops on the objective here. So it doesn't necessarily have to be, can I move and charge in 2 turns to get onto the, you know, to threaten whatever's struggling. Your opponent can move that unit. So if you just move a slower brick up this way to threaten here, they can move their unit around to the side. You just want to make sure that you can support your you know, support the units that you've got on these objectives in whichever way is useful. And that might be just putting another scoring unit on top of where you are already. So you want to look for the smallest lines possible. So what have we got here? So we're talking under 20 inches. I think it's about 20 inches center to center, something like that. And then from here to here, if I, sorry, my mouse is on its last legs, 23 inches, so a little bit longer, but nowhere near as long as 35 inches. So if we want to try and contest as many as possible, spoiler, realistically, unless you've smashed the game, you can't contest 4 objectives. That's just not going to happen. Your opponent will have their own game plan. They'll have their own scoring units. They're going to try and stop you from winning the game. The best you can do is you want to be holding at least 1. You want to be holding at least 2, because there's an even number of objectives here. You want to be contesting a 3rd. So theoretically, if you're doing that, you want to make the triangle, the lines on the triangle, as small as possible. And in that case, the smallest triangle is not this. The smallest triangle is this. And how do we set up to threaten this? By overloading one side of the board. Hopefully that makes sense, just as a very basic premise as to why you would maybe skew more heavily over to the right-hand side on strategic locations 4, or, you know, if you're playing on Upon the Fields of Glory, where your deployment zone goes out all the way off the board, well, not off the board, but it goes the whole way across, you can posture to threaten one side and then overload to threaten the other. It depends which way you want to play it, but in my opinion, the way to most consistently score against an opponent who doesn't have more pressure than you is you want to be looking at making the lines on your triangle as small as possible so that you can travel between each objective the shortest distance and support yourself like so. There we go. So that's why I think on Encirclement and Upon the Fields of Glory, if you're playing strategic locations 4, skew more heavily over to one side. And, you know, your opponent might not do that. Your opponent might threaten to push quite heavily into you. Be ready for that. You're not the only person who is allowed to try and dictate the course of the game. So, back to the course of the game, and I'm going to walk you through the choices I made in terms of deployments for both armies, because I think that's an interesting way of talking through why you might do certain things and why you might prioritize certain areas for deployment. Obviously, there's no terrain on this board. That adds an entirely different wrinkle, and maybe that'll be the next video, you know, talking about deployment in terms of terrain or how to play around terrain. That might be something that we talk about in a future video. So, for now, just looking at the board, if we look from the Troll Horde perspective, because I want to, theoretically, instead of going just straight forwards, I want to go up and round. The things that are going to have to travel the furthest are the units that are on this flank. The least far they have to travel is in the centre, and theoretically you probably want to contest the opponent's left-hand objective, or right-hand from their perspective. You want to contest this one, make sure that they're not just scoring it for free, but you don't want to put too much effort into that. You're realistically going to be trying to play around these 3 and threaten this one without putting too much commitment into it. So, how have I done this? The choices I've made. This unit of trolls here, this is a unit of 5 instead of 6. So the unit of 6 trolls is in 2 ranks of 3, which means that it's going to be able to wheel more easily. Because this unit of trolls is 5 wide, it's going to be much less mobile, and it is the least mobile but heavy hitting, you know, still a scoring unit that we want to have an objective. I want this unit here to move the least out of all of the units I've got. Next up, I've got my second scoring unit, this unit of trolls. Because it's 6 strong, I've put it into 2 ranks of 3, and that means that it can move more quickly. I've angled it so it can theoretically just walk out here. You know, with a 12-inch move, it's in range, pretty comfortably in range as well. And it can start to move around and threaten to move over to my opponent's natural objective if they, you know, if I want to go for that one, or I can just stand where I am. You know, both of these are good choices. So that makes sense in terms of the 2 scoring core units that I've got to prioritize there. What have I then done in terms of putting everything else? Well, I've got the Boar Boys. This list is nice in that it's got a couple of fast pieces. So it's got the Boar Boys here, and it's got the Wyvern, and all of these are going to be more heavily skewed towards the right-hand flank because they're the fastest things that we've got. Yes, the 7-inch move Boar Boys are not faster than the 9-inch fly Orc Wyvern Warboss, but that doesn't, you don't have to be a slave to it. It's not a case of just go, let's go down the checklist. Who has the fastest units in the you know, which unit do I have has the highest movement speed? Oh, the Wolf Riders, they've got units, you know, movement 9, so they have to be as far over to the right as possible. There is still some thought that you put in there, but in terms of the things that we want to aggressively bully with, I've got the faster pieces of the list, the 7-inch move Swift Stride Boars, they're going to be on this side of the board, and then also the Wyvern, which is doing the same. In terms of the Wyvern, because in this list the Wyvern is the general, I've kept it more central, just making sure that I'm providing, you know, a decent bubble here. You can see 18-inch bubble. All of the stupid stuff is in range there. Just providing leadership is generally a good idea, and having it in this sort of list is good as well. Other than that, we've got just some central pieces here. The Troll Hag, this is a central buffing piece that also wants to get up into the middle of things and get aggressive, so it's gone pretty centrally. It only moves 5. It's the slowest thing in the list. It's slower than the 6-inch move River Trolls, so this really wants to be front and center, but it also wants to try and be within range of, you know, covering the other unit. Even if it was only a 12-inch command range, it would still be in range of the second unit of trolls. It's a large target, it's got a bigger command range, or it would if it was a general, but, you know, you keep it central there. And then I've got the Ogdra's Wizard with his backing up unit of River Trolls there just centrally as well. And again, just making sure that I'm covering my pieces. The final wrinkle on this deployment is the unit of Goblin Wolf Riders, and this is a scoring unit. It's got a wizard in there, so this is something that never wants to be in the thick of things. It doesn't want to be holding objectives. You know, you don't want to be contesting for this one against a big unit of ranked up Gore. You're not going to win that fight. What can you do? Well, you can see that your opponent's got a couple of small pieces like Razor Gore here. You've got a smaller unit of Gore like so. You've got the Chariots. What we might do is send the small unit of Wolf Riders up like this to, you know, aim to contest this objective. So sit just within range of it. Fire off some shortbow shots, fire off some magic missiles, fire off a Ruby Ring of Ruin, potentially get this unit of Gore down below unit strength 10, make it so that that's not going to be scoring anything, potentially picking off these Razor Gore before they bring harm to any of the central pieces, just being an annoying flanking unit. The sort of thing that you were doing before objectives came in, where, you know, you'd have this sort of unit running around on the flanks, you wouldn't be putting it centrally. You can still do the same thing even though there are objectives you want to score. Don't feel like you have to use pieces that don't suit that sort of playstyle in that sort of very aggressive manner. You can still use them more as like a hit and run skirmishing piece. So to have a quick look at the other side as well, the Beastman list has significantly less scoring, and as I said, these are old lists. This is not what I'd be expecting to see necessarily, and then because the list would be different, you'd get to make different choices. But in this list, we've got one big scoring Death Star, and then we've got one smaller scoring unit that just sort of wants to contest on flanks. And I can put these Wolf Riders back away as well. So what were the choices that I made in terms of here? Well, in terms of where do I want this slow scoring brick to be? As with the, you know, the unit of 5 trolls that were in, you know, a wider column, so hard, a wider rank, so it's harder for them to maneuver around. This unit is going to want to be front and center. It wants to make its fight happen here, between here and here, basically. This is where I want most of the contesting to be. I don't want to have to be too aggressive with it in terms of, like, I don't want to move over here and then over here and over here. That's going to take 12 turns of a 6-turn game. We're not going to get anything done if we try and put this unit off on the outskirts. So we're keeping the slower scoring piece more centrally. And then we have thrown thrown this objective, this unit of gore, over towards the objective here, and I'm not realistically expecting to get a huge amount of points from this. I'd love to, and that's why I've backed it up with a couple of units of chariots. Chariots are slow-ish. They're a middling ground unit in terms of, obviously, movement 7 or 8, depending on what sort of chariot we're looking at. We've got 7 here, but no swift stride, and that's a really big downside in terms of playing the maneuverability game. But now that people are playing infantry, you can still outmaneuver them. So theoretically, while it's a slower unit, we can, in the context of Beastmen, it's more quick. If we just look at where a 14-inch march might end this unit up, something like this, there we go. Sure, that's not necessarily getting where we want to be on turn 1, but with another 14 inches, turn 2, something over here, you could very quickly start to get round and cut the board, change the shape of the board. This one could go up like, let's say, 12.3, 1.7 for turn 1. Turn 2, you can start to see the angles that we're going to be taking with these chariots to potentially threaten the central point on turn 3, or we can use them to protect the scoring gore that are in the centre. So this unit here wants to contest the central point, and it doesn't want to go too far forwards. If the Wolf Riders come into the centre to try and contest, if we've got a chariot like this, we can just threaten to charge the Wolf Riders. Obviously the Wolves run away, but if they're running away, what are they not doing? They're not contesting the centre. So we can still score points on our turn, and potentially on our opponent's turn, depending on how far we make those goblins run away. Make them deal with leadership issues, all of that good stuff. So we've got the central scoring unit here, we've got the smaller scoring unit backed up by a couple of pieces that want to protect it and or threaten the flank of our opponent's army. Then we've got a lot of the throwaway drops. Obviously, if you were doing this against a real person and not just sat in your room putting 2 armies together on Warhol, which I do embarrassingly often, we've got a couple of the Razor Gore here and another Razor Gore here. This is the sort of thing that you've put down first. These are just sort of bait drops, and as you can see, what I've done is I've put them near to objectives like so, but I haven't put them in front of objectives. I've made sure that if there's anything that I want to be front and center, so I go, you know what, I really want to contest this objective later in the drop process, I've put both of these giant spawn in terms of being as close as possible. And as you can see, there's nothing that's in front of them. There's a direct line straight to them. I didn't want to waste my early positioning on, blocking them out. Sure, if the spawn was here and the Razor Gore was, on the other side of it, is it the end of the world? No, but it's a slight efficiency downside. You don't move as far. It's more difficult for you to get the charges in on your turn 2, turn 3, whatever it is. So just making sure that the early drops here are not taking up key space, not going to be sitting opposite any of the objectives, so that I've got, plenty of room to maneuver. Other drops as well, the Warhounds in this sort of list. Warhounds, I think, they're a weird unit, obviously. Anyone who's been playing against Warriors of Chaos or Beastmen knows exactly how effective having them in marching column is. They will vanguard forwards, prior to turn 1 7 inches, and then also potentially just do some sort of unbelievably frustrating marching column shenanigans. So you end up with a blocker that goes something like, I don't know, let's say here, wheel round, like so. They've got a 21-inch movement. They can do whatever they want. Suddenly, this scoring unit of trolls isn't going to be able to get past them. Then, if they declare a charge, they flee off this way. You just want to be blocking off the objectives. And something that you can do on strategic locations 3 and 4, which you can't do on 2, is there are objectives that you have to move in terms of getting to score. And I really like using these sort of cheap marching column move blockers in that sort of early use as well. Last but not least, obviously, my favourite thing to do is talk about army lists. So let's put some of that in here. What are we thinking about putting into our armies that we maybe weren't previously in terms of scoring strategic locations? Strategic locations is going to be the objectives that you score the most over the course of a tournament, or if you're playing pickup games, it's the one where having multiple core units is the most important thing, because having that scoring over the course of the game really does add up. Every time I do a coaching game with one of my students who hasn't played them before, we get to the end of the game and they go, wow, that's a lot of points that either you or I have scored. Often it ends up being somewhere in the realm of one person gets 300 points in secondary and the other one gets around 650 to 700, which is obviously a big discrepancy. 350 points, that's usually going to be in the realm of taking it from a 10-10 to a 12 8, or maybe even a 13-7, something along those lines. So it's a big jump in scoring and something you want to be really aware of and making sure that you're taking advantage of. So what sort of things am I expecting to put into lists? Well, I don't like units of 10 anymore. Previously, I was looking at multiples of 4, so if I was looking at potentially archers, I might go 8 Deepwood Scouts. Now I'm going to be looking at 12 Deepwood Scouts, or even better, 14. Now, multiples of 4 are really good because they mean that if you take some casualties, you've got to take more models in terms of multiples of 4, because you've got to... When you take casualties for panic tests, you've got to take over 25% casualties to actually have to take the panic test. So whenever you've got a multiple of 4, that's the most efficient way to add a breakpoint without having to add a lot more points. However, I think going from 8 to 12 is, while it's good, going from 12 to 14, giving you 5 wounds that you have to lose, that is the sort of breakpoint I like putting into my lists in terms of having skirmishing infantry, something, whether it's dryads or archers, peasant bowmen, anything in that sort of realm, having that sort of unit where you've got 14 skirmishing models, you've got a little bit of protection from ballistic skill shooting in terms of your -1 to hit because you skirmish. Maybe you're looking at putting something in terms of you're gonna sit in a wood. There's a wood here, there's an objective here, you're gonna put your unit inside of the wood. All of that good stuff. You can stack other modifiers on there. Ruby Ring of Ruin, while it's harder to get off as well, that's going to do roughly 3 to 5 wounds to a toughness 3 unit that doesn't have any armor, which is typically what we're seeing if we're looking at stuff like Peasant Bowmen, or if you're looking at the more expensive Elf Archers, those sorts of T3 units. So I think 14 is great. It means that you get at least one more turn of scoring out of them, or your opponent has to put more pressure into that unit, more range damage, and if they're shooting your Peasant Bowmen, sure, yes, you're losing the scoring, but they're not shooting your Pegasus Knights, for example. So in terms of core scoring units, skirmishing archers, I like having them at 14. What do I think in terms of light cavalry? Light cavalry, I think, previously, I liked 8s. I was looking at 8s for Dark Riders. Now that we know that you can take up to 4 of the same core unit at 2,000 points, I quite like 6s. I've been running around with units of 6 Yeoman Horsemen, I think they're called. I should know this. Or Dark Riders, and you just go 4 times 6, and that gives you a lot of fast cavalry. Obviously, cavalry's unit strength 2, so you still, if you take 2 wounds on the unit, they stop being a scoring unit, but because they're cavalry, they're a lot faster, they're more able to move around the board and not take the incoming punishment from enemy shooting or anything like that. However, if you don't want to go for the full 4x6, I do still like 8s. You've then got 3 wounds. If you're thinking about stuff like Dark Riders or Yeoman Horsemen, those sorts of units can get up to a 5-up save. With a 5-up save, if we're talking about in terms of taking like a stray fireball, I wouldn't be surprised if I lost 2 to 3 models if I have a 5-up save and I'm a toughness 3 unit from a fireball there. So obviously dice can be out of your favour, but it just gives you that extra little bit of oomph. You're still going to be scoring, and you're still a big enough unit to actually have an effect on the table in terms of running around, firing some short bows or some repeater hand crossbows. Any of these sorts of things, that's the angle I'm going for. In terms of infantry, if we're talking infantry Death Stars, this really does vary depending on the army, but 30 is a good amount. If we're talking cheap troops, something like Yeoman Guard or skeletons, or what else are we talking? You could go, elves are quite expensive, so it's harder to go for big units of those. Empire State Troops, anywhere between sort of 30 and 40 models is really nice. You get, some redundant models in terms of you've lost, a second rank here at the back. Oh no, these models have died. I still get my 3 ranks with Horde or my 2 ranks without Horde. You're still scoring quite heavily there. It gives you a good amount of models in terms of infantry outnumber. You're probably not going to lose the unit immediately. You're not going to be brought below that sort of scoring threshold. So for me, if I'm looking for a cheap infantry unit where models are sort of in the range of like 4 to 6, maybe 7 points per model, I like having them in 30 to 36. You can go as high as 40, but I really like 30 to 36. Heavy infantry. Now, heavy infantry is weird because you can either go sort of like, here's a unit of heavy infantry that's going to do a job, in which case, 14 is still pretty decent, or you can go, I'm putting all my eggs in this basket, at which point I'd say, go as close to that 500 points maximum as you can. If you're talking dwarves, if you're talking elves, you're probably going to find that that takes you near enough 30 models as well. And yes, that's very similar to what I was saying in terms of the lighter infantry, but in this case, it takes a lot more commitment to do so. I would not go smaller. You know, if you're wanting to run a Death Star of White Lions alongside some Tracian Woodsmen, don't skimp on it. Make sure you're putting a lot of commitment in there. Go for the full 30 models with a magic banner, the full command, the whole shebang there. You know, if you can pay for stubborn, pay for stubborn. If you can pay for veteran, pay for veteran. These are rules that are really, really important in terms of your infantry Death Stars, and having them just makes them so much more reliable and consistent. And over the course of an event, or if you play more casually, over the course of, like, you know, however many games you play with the army before you decide to move on, or you change, or the game changes, you're going to find that you're getting a lot of value. And while it won't matter every game, it's going to come out in the wash very positively for you. Finally, cavalry, because if we're thinking about sort of scoring, we do still have heavy cavalry in core. That's something that's worth thinking about as well. And I'm on the fence about these. I think anywhere between 6 and 8 is the sweet spot, unless you're going for some sort of Death Star. Obviously, if we're talking Death Stars, Warriors of Chaos can do like a big knight bus very comfortably. You can put like 12 to 14 models in there. If you're going to do that, you know you're going to do that anyway. What am I thinking in terms of like Silver Helms or Empire Knights? I think somewhere between like 6 and 8, depending on what you want to go for. If you're looking to bring them mostly as a first charge user, then it doesn't actually matter how many you have. You probably just want to go small, 6, maybe full command if you want to just bring more combat res in terms of supporting whatever other units are going in and trying to break that unit of Graveguard. Sure, that's fantastic. Or if you're bringing them more as an actual punchy unit, maybe you've got a unit of Knights of the White Wolf, something along those lines, then 8 tends to be more of the size that I would think there. But hopefully that's helpful. I can see that my camera has just died and run out of battery, so this feels like a good natural point to end it. But lots to think about there, and hopefully that's been helpful in terms of thinking about how to approach not only writing your list, but how to play and deploy into strategic locations 2 through 4. Thank you for watching. Thank you for getting to the end of the video. If you've reached this point and you haven't already, I would really appreciate a like, a comment, a subscription if you haven't done those things. It just helps me get seen by more people, boost me up in the algorithm, all of the stuff that the YouTubers do like to say. If you would like to support me in my goal to become a full-time YouTuber, I would absolutely appreciate that. You can become a member below. There are various perks to those, name at the end of the videos, all that good stuff, but it also unlocks some VIP areas in Discord if you become a Longbeard or Ground Knight tier supporter. Those VIP sections are the only parts that are locked away in Discord. You don't have to be a member to join the Discord. I'd recommend that you should. We've got about 450, 500 people on there. It's a great place for discussion, a lot of fun. I do try and chime in as much as possible. And it's also where the Fix My List show lists are put, and also if you are one of the Ground Knight or Longbeard tier supporters, where you participate in choosing which list I play in the monthly Pick My List series.